to another episode of the Threshing Floor. My name's Randy Maugans, and I have a guest with me today, and we're going to talk about a pretty broad swath of topics that wrap around some subjects that need to be addressed, some things that we've kind of been on a quest for a very long time on this show. Some of it will be what many people would call conspiracy. It is in fact a conspiracy. There is, as Scripture says, a conspiracy. That's biblical. And so our guest today is from Canada. His name is Charles T. Wilcox. He's the author of Transformation of the Republic. And you'll find out more about what that really means. The Republic in this case does refer to the American Republic. The blurbs on the book that caught my attention for this, The Transformation of the Republic, The Origins of the Religious Hijacking of the American Government, and the Truth Behind the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Now, that may seem poles apart, but I believe Charles does a beautiful job of wrapping up a whole lot of threads in the course of this book, and we'll tell you how to get the book too. The website is ctwilcox.com. And Charles, I welcome you to the Threshing Floor.
Well, thank you, Randy. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I want to open up here with a couple of things that you wrote in the introduction to the book, and I think these will help frame for our listeners where we're going with this. Those who have listened to this show know that I've spent a lot of time investigating different threads, largely leading to what I consider to be the corruption and now the complete apostate condition of what is called modern-day Christianity. But in the opening of the book, you write, in this writer's opinion, individuals cannot claim to be authentic Christians who love and honor God's commandments if they choose to murder their neighbors or sacrifice the gift of their lives on the altar of nationalism or misplaced religious fanaticism. Further in this you go, every person has the right to choose their religion and answer to their God, but no one person has the right to use the machinery of the state or various other methods to force that choice on their fellow human beings, nor do they have the right to use religion as a means to a political end. And then in the course of that, you kind of almost go from Lincoln to Iraq, which is an amazing transition, but you do it so deftly, in talking about the Israeli massacres of towns and villages on the West Bank and Gaza in the name of a God, and I'll just quote this, in the name of a God who they believe has given them the right to this land because they have been misled to think they are still chosen, when in fact the true chosen, a holy nation referred to as the Israel of God, which is spiritual in nature, are those who hold the same faith that Christ held and practice what he taught. And I think at this point our listeners will recognize that this is pretty much the message that we've tried to articulate for over 5 years on the show. Charles, tell us a little bit about the journey that brought you to writing this book and how you finally came to do something this vast a piece of research, which encompasses what is obviously this overarching conspiracy.
Wow, that's a tall order. Well, I mean, it goes back to my childhood, basically. I have relatives that live in the States, and at that time they were living in Ohio, and they would come up periodically to visit when I was living in southern Ontario, and we would go up to cottage country north of Toronto and that, and we'd kind of get into discussions and stuff, and some of it revolved around history, and some of it revolved around geography, neither of which was being taught in their public school system at that time. I don't imagine things have changed a whole heck of a lot.
No, they've gotten worse.
And what we were being taught in our grade school system was like diametrically opposed to what you guys were being taught. For instance, like the War of 1812, it was I think down there it's kind of passed off as some sort of British invasion that you were repelling, or I'm not too sure. What we're taught is that it was a pure case of American expansionism coming into Canada, and they got as far as maybe the Toronto region and that, and then were kind of driven back across the border. And then, as far as the west wing of the White House being burned down to the ground, apparently it was a bunch of, well, we're taught anyway, it was just a bunch of guys from Halifax that got liquored up and whatnot and decided to go on a tear. Let's have some fun. And the White House kind of became the White House because they had to cover it in white paint because it was covered in soot and, kind of charred and whatnot, right? So thank Canada for having a White House.
There you go.
But yeah, and a lot of it centered around, like civil. It was just the whole history of early North America, like thoroughly different. And then when I was going to various churches when I was a child, I couldn't understand why there was this linkage with politics all the time. And I was reading the Bible when I started when I was like 5 years old.
Yeah.
And thanks to my aunt, I really appreciate what she did for me in that respect. But when I was in the Air Cadets, which is the same thing as the Civil Air Patrol in the States or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
We would do like a church parade kind of thing every so often, and the church that I went to was High Anglican, which is almost the same thing as Roman Catholic. And in this particular church building, they had flags going along both sides of, where the people sit and that, right? And I asked the minister, what are all these flags all? Well, these are all the flags of the military battalions that we've supported throughout, the ages and that. Well, how does that jive with what Jesus said? That doesn't make any sense to me. And he couldn't really explain it. And so that kind of got me on a quest of comparing what the Bible says to what all these churches believe. And I just finally came to the conclusion that a lot of them are out to lunch. And I can't justify any Christian being involved in politics when Jesus himself, when even his own followers said, well, why don't you, get into the political field? They wanted to make him a king.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's a political office. And he said, no, absolutely not. My followers are not of this world.
Exactly. My kingdom is not of this world. That's
right, and that doesn't mean this planet,
right,
or anything like that.
He's talking world about system.
This world of politics, which is a man-made construct. And it goes all the way back to the fall with Adam, and that where he says, I will judge myself with what's right and wrong. Right, that's like the very, very beginnings of human politics, if you want to really get down to it. And so I couldn't stomach listening to these preachers, start discussing this world when we're not supposed to. It has nothing to do with Christians. We live in a different world. We live in a different sphere of influence, if you want to call it that. Mm-hmm. Even though we have to live amongst our neighbors and that, it doesn't mean that we have to partake in the same things that they partake in, in that whole process.
That's why I read what I read from the introduction to your book, because you got it. You got the idea here of exactly what it really does mean to be part of that spiritual construct, which is spiritual Israel. It isn't about a landmass. It isn't about God carving nations with his finger. It doesn't matter whether it's Israel or the United States. The other joke is people believe America was God-breathed. Please go back and look at the founding fathers of this country quickly, and you'll find out that they were Illuminists, and that they were deeply influenced by a lot of the movements that came out of the same thought streams that we're going to talk about on this show today. So, I find it interesting that we've been on this journey together, arriving at these same conclusions. Your book deals heavily with Abraham Lincoln and with what is called euphemistically now the Civil War, the war between the states, I think you and I agree that it probably was an international war, that it was fomented internationally, financed most certainly out of Europe, and was part of a scheme designed to lay to waste the American experiment, which would have been a huge threat to the European power and money interests.
Here, let me give you a quote from German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck discussing that entire period of American history. He says that the division of the United States into federations of equal force was decided long before the Civil War by the high financial powers of Europe. These bankers were afraid that the United States, if they remained in one bloc and as one nation, would attain economic and financial independence, which would in turn upset their financial dominion over Europe and the world. Of course, in the inner circle of finance, the voice of the Rothschilds prevailed. They saw an opportunity for prodigious booty if they could substitute two feeble democracies burdened with debt to the financiers in place of a vigorous republic sufficient unto herself. Therefore, they sent their emissaries into the field to exploit the question of slavery and to drive a wedge between the two parts of the Union. The rupture between the North and South became inevitable. The masters of European finance employed all their forces to bring it about and to turn it to their advantage. And Abraham Lincoln realized this. He knew that the Rothschilds, who hold the official title of Guardian of the Vatican Treasury, by the way, that's kind of the linkage to the Vatican there, he stated the money power, meaning the Rothschilds and the Jesuits, preys upon the nation in times of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolvent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned. An era of corruption will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated in the hands of a few people and the republic is destroyed. That is exactly the situation you have right now.
Yeah, it's completely prophetic.
Yeah, totally.
And let's go back now, and maybe you can help me pull some threads together. So we have the monarchical powers in Europe. We have the Rothschilds, who are the bankers to the Pope and also the bankers to the Crown of England. Is that not correct?
Right, and bankers to the United States. Because you got to remember that the U.S. banking system, as it stands right now, is nothing more than an arm of the Bank of England. It's a branch off. Power goes... Your taxes ultimately go to the Vatican. If you really want to get down to the brass tacks, right? The IRS collects on behalf of Federal Reserve System. They take that money, ship it across the Atlantic to England. England then ships it to the Vatican, right? And that's how the Vatican turns around and is able to buy up this, that, and everything else. All these land holdings and the real estate, the businesses, they're into all kinds of booze, right? You go into a liquor store and you buy Benedictine. What do you think?
I mean, exactly.
Come on. So all these enterprises and and then you have these orders like the Jesuits that take a lot of that money and become majority shareholders in the Bank of America and other banks and so that's kind of how all that whole circle kind of goes, right? Let's get back to the beginnings. You had a bunch of people that were pretty choked at living under a system of government that they did not want to live under anymore. So you have the Revolutionary War, and then you have the Bill of Rights and the Constitution coming up. The whole world is looking at this. Most of the world, especially in Europe and that, are looking at the fact that the United States just pulled off the biggest coup in history against the monarch. Think that they are placed in their position by Almighty God himself and who have the complete backing of the Pope. What they were living under in Europe was very much a symbiotic relationship. The monarch is obeyed as if he was God, right? And the church supported that by telling their parishioners, support your monarch because he's placed there by God.
Oh, Romans 13.
Yeah, that's a real marvelous perversion of that, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because Romans 13 is not talking about political leadership whatsoever.
Not.
It's talking about church leadership. It is talking about spiritual leadership, the
Back when there
spiritual
was,
hierarchy.
right.
It is not talking about politics at all.
Thank you.
So we got that out of the way. So what happened was you've got this push for political and intellectual freedom, and it's starting to catch fire in Europe. The European monarchs are scared to death that they're going to lose all of their standing and all of their power and all of their wealth if they don't somehow put this movement in check. So they came up with a document, an agreement called the Treaty of Verona. And the Treaty of Verona was an agreement between certain European monarchs and the Vatican to destroy popular representative government worldwide, beginning in Europe and expanding to its fountainhead, the United States. The people that were put in charge of implementing that treaty was the Jesuit order. Now, at the same time that happened, Prince Metternich of Austria, who was kind of like the head cheese, decided to start up a foundation that would essentially pay for the immigration of the dregs of Europe, mostly Roman Catholics in religion, to ship them over to the United States and overwhelm a vote, because they saw a loophole here, a big one, right? And that's called one man, one vote, and the power of system of government, right? Where it's very much like a bottom-up system. The people decide what kind of government they want, and it's not dictated to them by any monarch or anything, right? So they ship these people over. They got this like huge slush fund and ship these people across the Atlantic to bolster the numbers, to eventually one day put in their own candidate who they know will be loyal to, first of all, a monarchical type system of government, which in many, many cases, it gets transformed into a dictatorship of one form or another. And that dictatorship ultimately is backed by the clergy. So they bring all these people over, settle them, and then give them the power of the vote and put in their own candidates who they know will eventually try to pervert the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and move in that direction towards a more authoritarian, autocratic type government. That's the bigger plan. So that's and they've been working on that ever since 1822.
Okay, let's pull into the conversation now how the Jesuits work into this. The Society of Jesus, the Sons of Loyola, as they're also known. Those who want to do a little boning up on this subject can just go out and do a Google search on Ignatius Loyola, and you'll get a brief history of the formation of the Jesuits. But I think what many people lack in their understanding, and what I myself lacked in understanding for a long time, was a firm grasp on just how insidious the Jesuits have been in insinuating themselves into the American system, and how they worked to undermine the Republic, even probably from the very beginnings of the Republic.
Okay, well, like Samuel Morse, the inventor of the Morse code, wrote a couple of books on that, explaining exactly how that worked. Both those books, by the way, are up on my website as downloads, and these are not like typewritten versions. These are the actual book from 1835 that were photocopied page by page and then turned into a PDF, right? The Jesuits initially were formed as a response to the Reformation of Martin Luther. All of our freedoms can be traced back to Martin Luther and the people that came after him, like the whole Protestant Reformation thing, right? The Jesuits were formed to counteract that and destroy all the freedoms in every respect. And they were also placed in a position, like when the Treaty of Verona came about, they were the ones that were instrumental in putting that doc in an actual practice. They came across the ocean in the office of like educators and that, right? And so they set up their universities. So here they are stating that they are there strictly to educate people and that. But what their education was designed to do was to sap a citizen's interest in his own country away from his own country and toward the papacy, towards Vatican interests, right? That's kind of the whole thing. So, and they act covertly. How do I put it? Yeah, covert. the best way to get around their headspace is to go to the oath that they have to take, because there's about 4 different levels of Jesuitism. The higher levels, and they're set up like a standing army. They have rank, okay? The highest rank, the officers, the high officers, have to take an oath that state that their oath actually says, "You have been taught to insidiously plant the seeds of jealousy and hatred between communities, provinces and states that were at peace, to incite them to deeds of blood, involving them in war with each other, and to create revolutions and civil wars in countries that were independent and prosperous, cultivating the arts and sciences, and enjoying the blessings of peace. To take sides with the combatant, to act secretly in concert with your brother Jesuit, who may be engaged on the other side, but openly opposed to that which you might be connected, only that the church might be the gainer in the end, and that the end justifies the means." So here they're talking about infiltration and subversion. They go further and discuss how they will ultimately exterminate anybody who does not believe in the same thing that they do. And they're doing this all, by the way, in the name of a loving God. Go figure.
Yeah.
Here is their form of love and generosity. Okay, I furthermore promise and declare that I will, when opportunity presents, make and wage relentless war, either secretly or openly, against all heretics, as I am directed to do, to extirpate and exterminate them from the face of the whole earth, that I will spare neither sex, age, or condition, that I will hang, waste, boil, flay, strangle, and bury alive these infamous heretics, rip up the stomachs and wombs of their children, and crush their infants' heads against the wall, in order to annihilate forever their execrable race. That when the same cannot be done openly, I will secretly use the poison cup, the strangulating cord, the steel of the poniard, or the leaden bullet, regardless of the honor, rank, dignity, or authority of the person or persons, whatever may be their condition in life, either public or private, as I at any time may be directed to do, by the agent of the Pope or the superior of the Brotherhood of the Holy Faith of the Society of Jesus.
Yeah, that pretty much, that sums up the Sermon on the Mount perfectly, doesn't it? Somebody tore that part out of my Bible. We are with Charles T. Wilcox. He is the author of the book Transformation of the Republic, and we're talking about the Jesuits, the Vatican, and the political intrigues that began with the seeds of this nation and are playing out in what may possibly be, in their eyes at least, if not in reality, the final round right now. What you're seeing in play is a very long arc of a big game that has at its end point the complete utter destruction of Christian America, Christian civilization as we would know it. We're going to take a break here, and when we come back, we're going to continue looking at the broad view of history through the eyes of Charles Wilcox and the transformation of the Republic when we return on the Threshing Floor. Welcome you back to the second half of the Threshing Floor. My name is Randy Maugans. With me for the last half hour and continuing through the rest of this show is Charles T. Wilcox from Canada. He is the author of the book, The Transformation of the Republic. And Charles, why don't you go ahead and tell us about your website, the book, how people can get the book, and anything else you want to kick in there about your various activities. Sure.
Okay, the website is ctwilcox.com. That's spelled WILCOX.com. If you want to buy the book online, it's only available through Lulu Press, and there's a link there that I have on the homepage, and you set up an account with Lulu, and you can buy it directly from them, and when you submit your order, they will actually print it off right then and there. The alternative is to, if you want to send an international money order. Now in the States there's two different kinds of money orders. One is meant for domestic use only, and that's the one that I cannot use. Canada is not a part of the United States yet. Right.
Or vice versa.
So it has to say international money order in U.S. funds, and I will send you a signed copy if you'd like. And if you kind of want to tool around the site, there's a lot of interesting stuff that I've put up there that kind of ties everything together. Things that were started back in the 1800s and how they're playing out today, 200 years later, and that. There's a couple of books there, like I said, written by Samuel Morse. Right. That I think I'm the only person on the entire net that has those books up. Now, getting into what Samuel Morse said regarding how the Jesuits operate in the United States, okay, he kind of gave an analogy, right? He says, let us suppose that the Emperor of Russia, in a conceited dream of divine right to universal empire, should parcel out our country into convenient districts and should proclaim his intention to exercise his rightful sway over these states, not now under his control. Should we not justly laugh at his ridiculous pretensions? But suppose he should proceed to appoint his viceroys and grand imperial dukes, giving to one the title of His Grace of Albany, to another the Grand Duke of Washington, to yet another His Imperial Highness of Savannah, and should send them out to take possession of their respective districts and subdue the people as fast as he can to their proper obedience to his legitimate sway. And should these pompous viceroys, with their train of sub-officers, actually come over from Russia and erect their government houses and commence by complaint matters and fair promises to procure lands and rentals to hold in the power of the emperor, and under the guise of educating the rising generation, should begin to sap the foundations of their attachment to the government by blinding their reasoning faculties and by Russian catechism instilling the doctrine of passive obedience and divine right of the emperor, what should we say to all this? Suppose then, further, that the emperor's cause by Russian emigration and the money supplied by the emperor had become so strong that the viceroys were emboldened to try their influence upon some of the local elections, that the Russian party had become a body somewhat formidable, that its foreign leaders had their passive obedience troops so well under command as to make themselves necessary in the police of the country, that we feared to offend them, that the secular press favored them. And to that he has a footnote. He says, is that a harsh judgment on the secular press? If a secular paper ventures to remonstrate against Roman Catholics, is not the cry of intolerance or persecution at once raised and the editor scared away from his duty of exposing the secret political enemies of the Republic under the false notion that he is engaged in a religious controversy? And then he goes on, and the unprincipled courted them. To what point, then, in the process of gradually surrendering our liberties to the Russian Tsar, should we have come, all right? Now, what is the difference, really, between the real claims and efforts and conditions of popery at this moment in these United States and the supposed claims and efforts and condition of the Russian despotism? The one comes disguised under the name of religion. The other, more honest, would come in its real political name. Change the name of religion and call the emperor pope and his viceroys bishops, interchange imperial decrees with pious cant, and you have the case of pretension and intrigue and success too, which has actually passed in these United States. Yes, the King of Rome, acting by the promptings of the Austrian cabinet in the plenitude of his usurpation, have already extended his scepter over our land. He has divided us up into provinces, appointed his viceroys, who claim their jurisdiction from a higher power than exists in this country, even from His Majesty himself, who appoints them to and removes them at will to whom they owe allegiance, for the extension of his kingdom and his power. Right? That's talking about the Pope. So basically, he said, he gave that analogy, right? He says, so what you're dealing with is a political takeover under the name of religion.
Most people never bother to extend the title of king or a monarchical figure to the pontiff of Rome. they look at him as clergy. They look at the Catholic Church strictly as a religious structure, failing to understand that the Vatican, which probably needs to be distinguished here from the Catholic Church in the strictest of terms, is in fact a world-recognized political division unto itself.
Right. The Vatican is the political arm of the Roman Catholic religion. It's unique in the sense that you have a religious entity that also operates as a political institution. And your bishops, your cardinals, and your priests and all that stuff, they act not only in the spiritual realm, they also act in the political realm as judges and magistrates and ambassadors and that type of deal. And what Samuel Morse was describing back then has played itself out recently. I mean, you watched all that entire march that went across the entire United States with the Mexican migrants waving their flags. Mm-hmm. At the same time that was happening, I've got a Newsweek article here where Cardinal Mahoney out of Los Angeles, who was bragging about commanding the votes of 5 million people, was basically wetting his pants in the Vatican, watching this on TV, happy that he was able to pull this off, right? Because how it more or less came about in Los Angeles, that's kind of where the root of a lot of this started, right? Was Mahoney got in touch with some radio hosts that he knew. Those radio hosts went out on Spanish radio and stirred up all these people to march in the streets against any laws that would make them be deported back to Mexico and Guatemala and whatever other country they came from. And here they are demanding the same rights as American citizens when they're not even citizens. Essentially, that's what was going on. And so they want to change the entire political game, call it a human rights issue rather than what it really is, a political takeover. And that's how you've got the church clerics involved in that entire process.
Maybe where we need to go at this point is just continue on the arc with the Jesuits. I want to refocus on that a little bit. We've looked a little bit at the historical background of the Jesuits, but the Jesuits have had a long time to spin their webs within various structures. We know, and you pointed this out too, that they are behind many of the universities in the United States. They have infiltrated the political system at a high level. They have a group of people, the Knights of Malta, and also another group called Opus Dei, which have infiltrated the American culture through our business and through our, essentially our social structure, I guess. Opus Dei what is Opus Dei exactly?
I'm not too sure. I know that, from what I understand, Mel Gibson is a member.
It was explained to me as being largely comprised of businessmen and people who are operating in the commercial sector. A lot of money and a lot of political power. Both on this side of the Atlantic and in Europe. That's and apparently this whole. Immediately prior to the Soviet Union dissolution, Opus Dei was used by Washington and Rome to get into Poland and start the revolution there. Lech Walesa.
And Brzezinski was instrumental in using Opus Dei in order to accomplish that. So it was Washington, Opus Dei, and Pope John Paul II started the collapse of the Soviet Union in Poland, and it just came off like a little domino kind of deal, right? That's how that all came about. What I'd like to get into is taking how did Abraham Lincoln come to the full understanding of what was going on? Okay, because this is key in history that has never ever been taught. It goes back to a court case in Urbana, Illinois, and it was at that point in time that he came face to face with the Catholic Church trying to railroad an innocent priest on a phony charge of rape, and Abraham Lincoln and his defense team defended a gentleman by the name of Charles Chinnicky. Charles Chinnicky was brought into Illinois from Kamouraska, Quebec, in order to bring in all these immigrants to populate and settle the Mississippi Valley from Illinois all the way down to New Orleans, right, and take it over for the church, right? But at the same time, he was absolutely disgusted with what was going on among the clergy in Chicago. They were corrupt like you wouldn't believe. They were taking collections from their parishioners and turning around and buying booze and hookers and engaging in corrupt business practices. They were having sex between themselves. All of these things that were going on, and Chiniki wanted to put a complete stop to it, and they didn't want him to stop it. Right?
Wasn't Chiniki at this point, wasn't he kind of moving towards a more scriptural, doctrinal lean in terms of he was actually reading the Bible?
He was actually reading the Bible, and he was trying to put in practice what the Bible taught. And a lot of things that he found were diametrically opposed to what his own church was teaching. He wanted to try to be another Martin Luther, if you really want to put it in that kind of context, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but he was going to start in the United States, and so he was, totally disgusted with what was going on in Chicago, and tried to change it for the better. At that point in time, he wasn't thinking about getting out of the church. He thought maybe he could change it from within. Eventually, he left the church and became a Presbyterian, from what I understand. But it was through that court case where Abraham Lincoln and Stephen R. Moore, who was one of the law partners, defended Chiniki in an Urbana court in 1856. And during that trial, the Bishop Foley of Chicago was brought to the stand, and he had to testify to bring out certain aspects of Roman Catholic teaching and laws of the church, laws written by these two church leaders, kind of thing. Or this is what they believed, and it got to how Roman Catholics understand the term liberty of conscience. And the bishop at the time on the stand tried to dodge the question like forever. He just did not want to answer these questions, right? And the judge finally said, you have to answer under oath. And so he did. And and so you've got about a dozen Jesuits sitting in the gallery from Chicago and New Orleans watching this like a hawk, right? And when Lincoln was able to force the bishop on the stand to expose the parts of church teaching that they absolutely did not want exposed, that's when they headed in for Lincoln. And it was through that friendship that lasted up until Lincoln's assassination that he was able to understand exactly how this entire machine works.
This was right? Lincoln and Chiniki, correct?
This was Lincoln and Chiniki. It was through that court case they became very, very close friends. And then when Lincoln was elected president, Chiniki would come to visit him every year during his administration and kind of hang around Washington for a couple of weeks. And they would go out in their horse carts and whatnot and visit soldiers in the field and go to the military, like the field hospitals and that. And Chiniki was invited into the White House, and they would sit and have very lengthy discussions. And it was Chiniki that would this is what's happening, that's what's happening, this is why Meade decided, this is what happened with, this is why he decided not to chase after Lee, right? This is why and he's explaining, this is why the draft riots occurred, and all this stuff. So Lincoln was getting a complete understanding of how the Vatican was working behind the scenes to oppose him every time he turned around, right? So Lincoln was essentially one step ahead, and that they couldn't stand. But the whole antagonism with the church goes back to that particular court case. That's where he had his eyes opened. So,
effectively, Lincoln represented a threat to the monarchical powers, the money powers vested through the Rothschilds, and the Vatican itself. And
right.
It kind of leads us to where we possibly could tie up this segment, and I by no means consider this to be the last conversation we have on this show on the subject, because we've only scratched the surface. Mm-hmm. The forces behind the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, we've been, here in the United States, we've been given the same version of the Lincoln assassination that we got of the Kennedy assassination, the same kind of whitewash that we got about September 11th, 2001. We've basically gotten every time a single bullet theory that points to a patsy and a dupe. But in fact, in the background behind Lincoln's assassination, can we safely say the Jesuits lay in the bushes?
Absolutely. What's taught down there is basically that John Booth was a ringleader, and he pulled all these guys together on his own, that he came up with all this whole thing on his own, and, that's kind of how it's taught. That's not how it went down, okay? If you want to get to who was responsible behind that assassination, you have to follow John Surratt. John Surratt was, in his younger years, going through the priesthood. He was going to become, a Roman Catholic priest and that. So he had to, and his mother was a very, very devout Catholic. And the Surratt household, the Surratt Tavern, was constantly being visited upon by at least a half a dozen Roman Catholic Jesuits. And they, given their background and everything, their antagonism and animosity towards the entire Lincoln administration, they wanted to do something, right? So it was through Surratt that Booth came in. It was through Surratt that Atzerodt and Spangler and Davy Harold and all these guys came in, mostly through Surratt. And it was the priests that vetted each and every one of them. And they came up with this. They came up with how we're going to go about this, how we're going to, execute the plan, how we're going to get out of Dodge and that. And at the end of it all, Surratt escaped Washington, went up to Montreal, where he had two priests waiting for him. They knew in advance that he was on his way. They hid him out for about a half a year. They were carrying him around in disguise, sometimes in blackface like Al Jolson or something, and that, keeping him basically in the dark of what was going on in the States. The United States, it was the biggest manhunt in U.S. history looking for Surratt. The last place they're going to look is in the private residence of a couple of priests outside of Montreal, right? Eventually they put him on a boat to England. In England, he stayed for a couple of weeks in a church building there, was given some money. From there, he went to Italy and became a member of the Vatican Guard. They were called the Zouaves at the time. They knew that the United States wanted him back. The United States was threatening. We know that he's there, and he's going under the name of Watson. If you don't cough him up, we're going to confiscate everything that you hold in the United States. Well, the church, it's the last thing the church wanted. So they said, fine, we'll give him up to you. But what they did instead was plan a phony escape for him, right? So they helped him escape from the U.S. Secret Service and that, and said, well, oh, too bad, well, he escaped, right? There's nothing we can do. And the U.S. government bought it, but then they find out he's on a ship on his way to Alexandria, Egypt. So they had a Navy gunboat in the area in the Mediterranean, and they immediately sent a wire to the captain to hightail it down to Alexandria and intercept Surratt. He's going under the name of John Watson. Pick him up and bring him back to face trial here for the murder of Lincoln and the attempted murder of Secretary of State Seward. So they bring him back to face trial. Now, this is in a civil court, right, rather than a military tribunal. They pushed for a civil court because they knew if it was done in a military tribunal, the church would have absolutely no influence against it, right? So they pushed for a civil trial, which they got. Then they were able to diddle with the jury. They made sure that the jury was stacked with several very devout Roman Catholics.
And where was this trial held exactly?
In Georgetown.
Exactly.
In Georgetown, which is like Jesuit Central. They were able to hold this trial surrounded by all of his friends. His old alma mater. They knew who Surratt was, and they would come by and kind of glad hand him and high five and all that stuff, right? And it was just happy. They were able to play to the religious prejudices of the jury, and it wound up as a hung jury. Not once, but twice. Because they had to retry him because it was a hung jury, and they wound up with a hung jury again, and then they decided to hell with it, and let him go. The church was intimately involved in that entire affair. And then I was able to contact a member, one of the last surviving members of the Chinnicky family. Her name was Laura LaFave. She was in her late 80s, I believe, and she's dead now. But I was able to get documentation that that her family actually had squirreled away in the basement in this part of Quebec. Historians have no idea that this material even exists. And among this stuff were sworn statements of Jesuit priests in St. Joseph and St. Cloud, Minnesota, these statements basically said that we knew about Lincoln's assassination hours and days before it actually happened. And the entire community there, where there's a monastery and whatnot, they were talking about Lincoln's assassination as an accomplished fact at least 3 days before it actually happened in Washington. That is just absolutely damning evidence against the church. How on earth did they know days in advance that Lincoln was assassinated and talking about it to such an extent that they were almost celebrating the fact? Days before it even happened. Those sworn statements have been locked away for 120 years, and I was able to get my hands on them, and I asked if I could publish them, and I was given exclusive permission to publish them, and so that's what I've done.
And again, go ahead and give the website for the book.
Okay, the website is ctwilcox.com. It's WILCOX, and there's a link to Lulu. You have to set up an account with Lulu and order the book there. It's available in hardcover and paperback and PDF download. And if you want to, I will also accept money orders and Silver Eagles or Morgan dollars or whatever. If you want a signed copy, I have a few here that I can send out.
Let me say this about the book. In the course of a year's time in doing these shows, I read a lot of material. I get a lot of books. I have book authors on to largely expand the base of our own research here. Mm-hmm. This book was, I will say, one of the 5 most influential books I read last year, and probably number 1 in bringing me around to completely grasping the hugeness of the Vatican Jesuit connections and how they've monkeyed with the history of the United States and completely changed the face of what this country could have been and what it once was. And unfortunately, we scratched the surface just barely of a very large topic, of which I'm going to ask you to come back again very soon, Chuck, and we'll delve into it a little bit more, along with whatever else you have on your plate. This has been The Threshing Floor with author Charles T. Wilcox from Canada, The Transformation of the Republic. We will return again with another show very soon. I'm Randy Maugans. This has been The Threshing Floor.